This is panel number 1, passive vaping. Is banning vaping in public places justified? I mean, this is a topic to the very heart of the Spanish vaping community, I believe, because right now, the only places where you're not allowed to vape in Spain are hospitals, schools, public administration buildings, and public transport. But I've heard rumors that the government wants to step up the bans and extend the bans to other public places. And I really believe this is going to be a very interesting discussion. We have here a number of very talented discussants that will add flavors and spices to a very heated discussion. And I hope we're going to have a very nice debate. Let me settle the landscape, the agenda, by saying we've been seeing quite a lot of studies about secondhand vaping, and my understanding is really there's very little to worry about. Even though you can measure levels of nicotine, for example, in the blood of bystanders, even under naturalistic conditions, what you see is just a minute increment of nicotine, which has absolutely no clinical nor psychological, no psychostimulant consequences. So let me start with Ángel,
yes.
And see what you think about this, and what are your ideas in general, whether we can do better in order to inform the government about the future programs.
Thank you very much for your brief introduction. In my opinion, I don't think this is vaping is justified in public sectors. And let me give you some arguments, because we need to talk with arguments. I'm going to give a few arguments. The first one is today's, in this local, I have seen several people vaping, and nothing was noticed. Nothing. Second, and more important, if you remember my presentation, in which the results show that the vaping, the passive vaping is equivalent and 1/100 of the active vaping. So if we have a public local office or ministry, you will need thousands of people vaping in a few square meters, to reach significant level of nicotine, according to the data I introduced to you. So from the nicotine point of view, there is no scientific ground to ban vaping in a public building. Number 3, and I'm finished. You remember the global chemical spectrum I showed this morning of all components, in which the major component was nicotine. Now, if you believe and you accept the argument just given for the nicotine, you need to accept the same sort of argument for the rest of the component, which is significantly lower. So I finish momentarily. In my view, from the data I show you this morning, there is no justification, scientific justification, to ban the vaping in public buildings.
Okay, I mean, let me try to be the devil's advocate. I mean, if I were the Minister of Health, I would say, okay, let's assume the nicotine is not the problem, but what about the unknown unknowns? What about the other chemicals that may pollute environments, particularly environments where there are young kids, infants, or pregnant women? I mean, I will extend this comment to Miguel. I'm also a chemist, so probably you may have something to say. To me, let's assume that this me is a policymaker in the Spanish government, which unfortunately cannot speak any very little Spanish, so it's not really a real one.
Okay, thanks. The idea is when we look at the data regarding nicotine, this is true that nicotine is the main product. And when you look at this reduced level in the air when you are vaping, so you can notice that it will be reduced more and more for trace and ultra trace compound. Additionally, I am sure that the problems came from the fact that the policymakers identifies vaping as tobacco, and it is not true that we are speaking about the same. And if you are thinking that, but it produces fume, but it is not fume, this is vapor. And we know we know the composition. This is true that we can find some impurities, but impurities doesn't mean the main components. So I am sure that there is no reason to be worried about that. And there is no reason to be to adapt the same norms applied in the past for tobacco to be applied for vaping systems and other objects which try to reduce the harm of tobacco. And this is a contradictory, and this is a paradox, as you said this morning, because this is the paradox. We try to solve a problem, but we don't like to look at the solution. So once again, this is a problem which grows. And this is some dangerous thing, is to look at the identification of some potentially toxic compounds inside the vaping liquids, or also to look at the formation in the fume and secondary fume and so on. Because in these cases, okay, you can identify the compound, but please, after that, quantify the concentration, because the poisoning is the dose, it's not the compound. But sometimes public and newspapers remains in the name, this is a dangerous product, this is a cancerous product, but they don't look at the concentration level. At this concentration level, the truth is that it is nothing. So we must take care when we are producing our data and when we are sharing our data with the community to put the stress on the frame, the identification of the compounds. We have started with portable air control systems, which provides an average number of compounds. It is not enough. We must, but these data are not dangerous. We must look for the deep identification, but once again, we must look for concentration levels in order to be able to provide true data, which could be the base for rules and norms emitted by the policymakers.
Thank you, Miguel. My understanding really is this is more a political game than a scientific game. So, Julio, from your perspective of vapors and stuff, how would you weigh this problem of having a government pushing from a political agenda, equating vaping to tobacco smoking and making progress in this area of banning in public places, as opposed to the scientific evidence that we know they are very much in favor of vaping? Or if you want to introduce also the concept of etiquette, if you like. Maybe you don't really want to ban vaping based on health issues, but you may be vaping ban or restricting ban on etiquette issues. Please.
I will speak in Spanish.
Yeah, it's okay.
My English level is growing a lot in the last years thanks to vaping, but it's not enough. Bueno, yo quiero dar un punto de vista sobre este asunto desde la perspectiva de los usuarios, desde la perspectiva de los vapeadores. Y tengo 3 puntos apuntados que creo que son muy importantes para no justificar una prohibición del vapeo en lugares cerrados. El primero yo creo que es muy evidente, y es porque el hecho de prohibirlo en lugares públicos va a ocultar el vapeo, nos va a privar de un escaparate fantástico para que nuevos usuarios puedan abandonar el tabaco gracias a estos dispositivos, y lo va a ocultar, va a ralentizar mucho su crecimiento. También, perdón, se me acopla esto y me oigo 2 veces. También es evidente que si llegara una prohibición de este estilo, de cara a la opinión pública, eso en cierta manera haría pensar a la gente que si el tabaco está prohibido en un bar y el vapeo también, es igual de malo, ¿verdad? Inconscientemente la gente va a pensar eso y va a afectar muy, muy negativamente a la imagen del vapeo, evidentemente. Un argumento que muchas veces se utiliza para intentar justificar esa prohibición es que el gesto de vapear imita el gesto de fumar y que por lo tanto, bueno, pues eso puede incitar a la gente a fumar. Yo ante tal afirmación, bueno, pues digo que si eso es cierto, pues el hecho de beber agua también incita al alcoholismo. Yo creo que nadie que se beba un vaso de agua está incitando a quien tiene al lado a que se beba un vaso de whisky. Así que me parece un argumento completamente absurdo. Y por último, simplemente para cerrar, aparte de todo esto y a pesar de todo esto, creo que algo que sí es muy importante y que desde Anesvap y desde asociaciones siempre hemos promovido, es que a pesar de que ahora mismo no lo tengamos prohibido, esto simplemente es una cuestión de cordialidad, no de salud, por supuesto, pero siempre es importante el respeto. Si tenemos menores cerca, si estamos en un lugar demasiado concurrido y alguien se molesta, creo que es, bueno, pues simplemente por, como digo, por cortesía, no por salud, ser respetuosos, no caer en provocaciones, y de esa forma creo que de cara a una posible futura legislación pues nos irá mucho peor, porque crearemos una buena imagen como colectivo de vapeadores. Y ya está.
Muchas gracias. I think the idea of equating water to gin is a good kind of example. However, it doesn't really match to the vaping situation, because when you drink, this is just relates to yourself. It doesn't really affect anybody around you. When you vape or smoke, you know, the aerosols are going to have an impact on some other people. And I'm aware of evidence of people having asthma attack set off just by the smell of some of these of the flavorings from vaping. This doesn't really mean that we should be vaping, you know, electronic cigarette in such a way, but we should be considerate of others. I think the Latin says in medio stat virtus. We should find a way, whether it is convenient for people who vape to use facilities that cannot be used by smokers, and at the same time not to annoy people who do not vape or smoke. Konstantino, can you just try to sum up and what could be a solution that can be brought to the Spanish politicians for initial discussions?
It's quite a tough subject. First of all, scientifically speaking, there is no evidence that there is any harm from vaping, but you need to always discuss the context of the level of exposure. So, for example, if I invite in my living room 50 vapers who are doing direct lung inhalation, the environment is going to be very unpleasant. If any of you has been ever to a vape expo or whatever, you will see an environment which is, in my opinion, completely unacceptable. It's not harmful, but it's highly unpleasant. I'm a vapor myself, and I have substantial throat irritation from being inside a vape expo from too much aerosol. So now, the fog that you're looking at is simply PG and VG microdroplets, and because the environment and the air has been fully saturated, they are now present in microdroplets, which are visible, and that's why you see the fog. So it's not necessarily harmful, so it's not aldehyde, it's not any toxins. I even doubt that the levels of nicotine there are high enough to cause any concern. But it's a very unpleasant environment, even for a vapor. For a non-vapor, I think it would be unbearable. So, agreeing with what Riccardo said, we need to be considerate to others, and we need to be moderate in our consumption, especially in places where there are many vapors, in spaces that are somewhat confined in terms of the size of the room, and if it's closed space. And situations that exist in vape exports should be dealt with by, for example, increasing the ventilation or finding places where ventilation is good enough to address this issue. You know that researchers are going to vape expos to measure emissions. What they're finding is usually particulate matter, which is mainly the microdroplets that I mentioned, nothing more, but this creates a problem. Now, concerning nicotine, there's a lot of discussion about the release of nicotine to the environment, and it's true that nicotine levels can be measured after, when you look at the environmental emissions after someone is using any cigarette. But we need to understand that nicotine has never been implemented in neither smoking nor vaping related harm in terms of second-hand exposure, not even for smoking. It's not the cause of the disease due to passive smoking. There was a study in 2014, and I was looking for it just before, by a group of researchers from Barcelona, from l'Hospitalet de Llobregat, here in Barcelona, which found that that non-smokers who were exposed to vapor in homes where someone else was vaping had detectable levels of cotinine in their saliva, which means that they were absorbing some nicotine. But when you look at the numbers, and I made sure to calculate the numbers, and I had a comment at that time, that was 2014, in my blog, you would see that the amount of exposure and absorption daily was about 25 micrograms, not milligrams, not grams, micrograms. So it's 25 millionth of a gram of nicotine daily. This is below the level associated with any biological effect, not harm, but even any effect like the minimum that nicotine, the minimum biological effect that nicotine can have is a slight increase in heart rate. You won't even get that. It is the same as consuming 100 grams of eggplants if you eat 100 grams of eggplants. That's the amount of nicotine. So a lot of discussion just because we found nicotine, but totally irrelevant in terms of harm when you look at the amount of exposure. But as Riccardo said, and I fully agree with him, we need to be moderate, we need to consider the needs and the requests of others, and especially in places where many vapors gather, like in vape expos, for example, we need to be more careful and avoid all this very unpleasant atmosphere that is being developed there.
Thank you. I think it was super clear, and the points made are, one, things that they are detected, even in passive vaping, are not constituting a risk or any kind of risk. This includes nicotine, but most importantly, all other potentially harmful constituents of the aerosol, and how to deal with the issue of etiquette, because at the end of the day, this is the main core of the discussion. We want to bring a sort of proposal to the government saying, look, there's no reason to institute a law to protect the others because there's no evidence of risk, because the dose will be extremely low. They will be so minuscule that they will not kill not even an ant. So what do we do with this? We want, I think the fight needs to be strategic and should be strategic from your end. You don't really want to piss off the public opinion. You don't really want to annoy the public. The public has to love you. If you want the public to love you, you really need to be respectful. And that's the key to success. So you'll have a lot of support also from the rest of the society if you have a great respect for the rest of the society. At this point in time, I would like to take a few questions from the floor. Thank you.
Roberto, first of all.
And Roberto is number one.
I would like to make an analogy that has proven to be very hello? Yeah, an analogy that has been quite helpful for us. The analogies with music, because, for example, liquids doesn't work. Okay, there's some vaporization, but it's trivial. No, but music, because vaping can be as invasive, even not harmful as music. Like, for example, if we are in a street transport and suddenly somebody comes with a ghetto blaster, or it doesn't have to be hard rock, symphony, Beethoven, in the loud, audible volumes, and everybody is doing that, it would be a nuisance. It's same in a library, etc. However, people who enjoy music, even hard rock or whatever type of music, are entitled to have indoor spaces where they can enjoy their music. And the same thing has to apply for vaping. There is no reason for a blanket prohibition. There has to be some indoor places where voluntary exposure is tolerated and is legal and is legitimate, and this is the important thing, and the analogy with music is very helpful.
Which I like it a lot, because it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, you cannot just criminalize music, but obviously if you are in a carriage, in a train, and there are a lot of people that are quietly doing their homework or whatever, you don't really want to disturb them with a cacophonic sum of different music.
Hard rock.
It'll be, but I like the idea, and probably the organization in Spain should try to draft a kind of proposal along these lines. Is anybody in disagreement with, just one second, in disagreement with what Roberto just said? Disagreement? No. Okay, but you want to talk.
Please, could you speak into the mic? Otherwise, we can't translate. Sorry. Por favor, habla al micrófono. De otro modo, no podemos traducir. Gracias.
¿Ya?
In Spain, let's say that this is provided for by the law against public disturbance. If you jump up in a queue, this is not legally provided for, but is a case of a public disorder. On the other side, if you go to a restaurant and you vape and you make a big puff, this may annoy someone else in the restaurant. It is a topic of etiquette, of common sense. Perhaps we need no laws, strict laws providing for that. Even the one banning it on public places, schools, etc., I think that's enough. That's what we need.
Basically, I translate in my way. What he's explaining is that we've got already laws when you create a disorder, public disorder. So if we are acting with logical and with education, we are already covered. We don't need to go further and to create a new law regulating something that is absolutely logical, because in fact, as far as I understand, vaping is not a major problem compared with other things. So if we live in society, we have to take care of the others, vaping, and in other fields.
Under reasonable conditions, there is no evidence base in discussing about the regulatory implementation of vaping bans in closed places. It's purely an emotional and an aesthetical issue. So my opinion is that every owner of a closed place can define whether they allow vaping or not. So the owner of the restaurants, the owners of the cafeterias can determine whether they will allow vaping inside their business or not. But the evidence does not justify a governmental implementation of a de facto ban everywhere in all closed spaces. So if a restaurant owner doesn't like the optics of someone exhaling vapor, or doesn't like the smell from the flavors, although the smell is usually nice, but if they don't like it, they will have the right to implement a ban in their property. But that's very different from having a law by the government which must be universally applied everywhere. And right now, based on current knowledge, there is no scientific basis for implementing restrictions in vaping in closed places. Now, the response is that there has never been also any science basis for implementing bans in smoking in open places, like, for example, when you see in the US that you are not allowed to smoke in an open park, for example, which is completely nonsense. The reason is not to expose others to the view of someone smoking. Well, there is a better idea. Execute all the smokers so that they will never be, no one is going to be exposed to a smoker. Or put them in an underground cell in a jail so that they can smoke there and no one will be able to see them. I mean, at some point, there is no common sense. You lose all reasoning. It's just absurd decisions that make no sense at all and are clearly discriminatory and clearly targeting smokers, not the smoking act or the adverse effect of smoking. And it's just an obsession, nothing else. So I hope we will not reach to that level in vaping.
I hope not. That would be worrisome.
I just wanted to add 2 points that could be said to the authorities to understand the fact that that vaping is not causing much disturbance. The first one is that if we have banned smoking, if we have smoke-free laws, it's not because of smoking itself, but more about second-hand smoking, which doesn't exist in vaping. And that's where the smoke is the most dangerous, more than the one that the smoker is taking. And second thing is the half-life of smoke in a room is 20 minutes. The half-life of vapor is 11 seconds. So that's 2 points that could be added also to convince the authority that...
So you were making a reference to the side stream smoke, which is highly toxic than mainstream smoke.
Yes.
And of course, there's no side stream smoke in vaping products. Okay. Anybody? There was somebody else? Let's take this final question or final call. Anybody there? No? You've been talking too much?
Enough, Roberto.
Enough from you?
Just mentioning that you were talking about Anesvap, right, to do a sort of a chart.
Yeah.
Aegis did that in France.
Aegis,
the e-cig users.
the etiquette. Okay.
Yeah, the etiquette. There are 10 points in order to respect people in public places.
But that's been done on a voluntary basis.
Yes.
Okay, right. I think with this,
only one more thing, very.
Okay.
I would like to close with a small comment regarding this empty seat that we have right here. We invited people that really oppose the way in which we see things here. People who we are also addressing with all these comments so that they can think about all these issues. It would have been great to have them here sitting with us, giving us their point of view, and the fact that they didn't come, that they rejected the invitation, demonstrates that they don't have too many ideas to provide. Thank you.